I'm Ruth Lee, 52, a proud mother who spent months planning the perfect wedding gift for my son and his fiancée. When Sarah rolled her eyes and called me too traditional in front of the entire bridal party, something inside me snapped. The $15,000 check I'd written, I tore it up that very night. But what happened next would teach them both a lesson about respect, family, and the true cost of taking love for granted. You see, I'd been bending over backwards for months, trying to be the perfect future mother-in-law. I researched venues, compared photographers, even offered my grandmother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom passed down through 4 generations. But apparently, my efforts to honor tradition and show love through action made me too traditional for their modern sensibilities. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt dismissed by the people you've sacrificed everything for, like this video, let me take you back to where this all began. I'm Ruth Lee, and at 52, I thought I had figured out most of life's important lessons. I've been a successful real estate agent in our suburban community for over 15 years, building a reputation for honesty and dedication that keeps clients coming back. My colleagues respect me, my friends value my advice, and I've managed to create a comfortable life for myself and my son David. But being a mother, that's always been my most important job, especially after my husband Michael died in a car accident 8 years ago, when David was just 19. Those were the hardest years of my life. Watching my son struggle with grief while trying to finish college, I became his anchor, his cheerleader, and sometimes his soft place to fall when the world felt too heavy. I still remember the evening David called me, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Mom, I have something to tell you," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Sarah and I are engaged." My heart swelled with happiness for him. After years of casual dating and one relationship that ended badly, David had found someone who made him laugh again, someone who brought back the light in his eyes that had dimmed after his father's death. Sarah Martinez seemed perfect for him, at least on the surface. She was beautiful, ambitious, working as a marketing coordinator at a tech startup. She had an infectious laugh and a way of making David feel like the center of her world. When he first brought her home for dinner 6 months into their relationship, I was impressed by her confidence and the way she engaged with our conversation about current events and travel. I made a promise to myself that night. I would be the mother-in-law I wished I'd had. My own mother-in-law had been critical and distant, always finding fault with my cooking, my housekeeping, my parenting choices. I swore I would never make Sarah feel unwelcome or judged in our family. I would be supportive, generous, and understanding. So, when David announced their engagement, I threw myself into wedding planning with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for this moment for years. I researched venues within their budget, compiled lists of photographers and caterers, and even started a Pinterest board filled with elegant but affordable decoration ideas. I wanted to be helpful without being overbearing, supportive without being intrusive. The wedding planning binder I created became my pride and joy. I organized it with color-coded tabs, venues, vendors, timeline, budget, and inspiration photos. I spent evenings after work updating it with new ideas, pricing information, and contact details. Every page was filled with handwritten notes and sticky tabs marking the best options. I was genuinely excited about this wedding, not just because it was my son's big day, but because I was finally getting a daughter. But even in those early days, there were small signs that something wasn't quite right. Sarah would smile politely when I shared an idea. Then later I'd hear her telling David that his mother was a bit much, or that she wished I would let them handle their own wedding. When I suggested we all go wedding dress shopping together, she laughed and said she preferred to keep that experience more intimate, meaning just her and her mother. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. After all, every bride has her own vision for her wedding, and I was probably overwhelming her with my enthusiasm. I scaled back my suggestions and focused on offering support when asked, but the distance I felt growing between us left me confused and a little hurt. The warning signs were subtle but consistent. Sarah would make comments about old-fashioned traditions, usually with a laugh that took some of the sting out of her words. She questioned why we needed a formal rehearsal dinner, why the wedding party needed to walk down the aisle in a specific order, why we couldn't just have a casual backyard party instead of a stuffy church ceremony. I started to realize that what I saw as time-honored traditions that connected us to family and heritage, Sarah saw as outdated rules that cramped her style. But I kept hoping that with time and patience, we could find a middle ground that honored both her modern sensibilities and our family's values. 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, I decided to host a formal dinner to celebrate David and Sarah's milestone. I chose Meridian, an upscale restaurant downtown that had been Michael's and my favorite spot for anniversaries and special occasions. The dining room had warm lighting, crisp white tablecloths, and an atmosphere that felt both elegant and intimate, perfect for bringing our families together. I invited Sarah's parents, her sister, and David's closest relatives, my sister Jennifer, my brother-in-law Tom, and my nephew Marcus. I wanted this dinner to be a bridge between our families, a way to officially welcome Sarah into our clan, and show her how much we valued her place in David's life. The evening started beautifully. Sarah looked stunning in a navy dress that complemented her dark hair, and David couldn't stop smiling. Her parents, Maria and Carlos, were warm and gracious, sharing stories about Sarah's childhood and expressing their joy about the engagement. The conversation flowed easily through appetizers and the main course, covering everything from vacation plans to career aspirations. But it was during dessert that I made what I thought was a beautiful gesture, one that would later become a source of tension I never saw coming. I had brought a small velvet box with me, something I'd been saving for this exact moment. As the waiter served our tiramisu, I cleared my throat gently and stood up. "I have something special I'd like to share with Sarah," I said, my voice warm with emotion. I opened the box to reveal my grandmother's pearl necklace, a stunning strand of lustrous pearls that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family. The pearls were perfectly matched, each one glowing with that deep, creamy radiance that only comes with age and careful preservation. My grandmother had worn them on her wedding day in 1943. My mother had worn them to her high school graduation and her own wedding, and I had worn them when Michael proposed to me 28 years ago. "Sarah," I said, holding the box toward her, "I would be honored if you would wear these pearls on your wedding day. They've been in our family for almost 80 years, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather see wearing them as David's bride." The table fell silent. Sarah's eyes widened as she looked at the necklace, and for a moment I thought I saw genuine appreciation in her expression. But then something shifted. Her smile became more polite than enthusiastic, and she reached for the box with what seemed like reluctance. "Oh, Ruth," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "these are ... very traditional. They're beautiful, of course, but I'm not sure they'll work with the style I'm envisioning for the wedding." She held the necklace up to the light, examining it with the same expression she might use to evaluate a piece of furniture she was considering discarding. My heart sank a little, but I tried to keep my voice encouraging. "They're quite versatile, actually. The pearls would complement almost any dress style, and the length can be adjusted if needed. My grandmother always said pearls are classic because they never go out of style." Sarah's mother, Maria, leaned forward with interest. "May I see them?" She examined the necklace with obvious appreciation, running her fingers over the smooth surface of the pearls. "These are exquisite, Ruth. What a generous offer." But Sarah was already shaking her head, placing the necklace back in its box with a finality that made my stomach tighten. "I appreciate the thought, I really do, but I'm planning a more contemporary look for the wedding. These pearls are just so formal, so old-fashioned. I'm hoping for something more modern, more me." The word old-fashioned hung in the air like a slap. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, not just for myself but for my grandmother's memory and the legacy these pearls represented. Around the table, I could see the uncomfortable expressions on my family members' faces. Jennifer's eyebrows had risen slightly, and Tom was studying his dessert plate with sudden, intense interest. David, caught between his fiancée and his mother, looked miserable. "Sarah, maybe you could just try them on, see how they look." "David, I've already told you I have my own ideas about accessories," Sarah said with a slight edge to her voice. "I don't need to try them on to know they won't work with my vision." I forced a smile and closed the jewelry box, slipping it back into my purse. "Of course, dear, I understand completely. Every bride should have exactly what she wants for her special day." But my hands were shaking slightly as I put the box away, and I could feel the weight of my family's concerned glances. The rest of the evening passed in stilted conversation. Sarah's parents made polite attempts to redirect the discussion to neutral topics, but the damage was done. I could see the disappointment in Jennifer's eyes, and the way David kept glancing between his fiancée and me with growing anxiety. As we prepared to leave, Sarah did approach me with what seemed like genuine remorse. "Ruth, I hope I didn't hurt your feelings about the necklace. It's just that I have such a specific vision for the wedding, and I want everything to be perfect." I hugged her, trying to project understanding and acceptance. "Of course, Sarah, your wedding day should be exactly what you dream of." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us. The necklace wasn't just jewelry, it was a symbol of welcome, of belonging, of being embraced by a family's history, and she had rejected it as easily as she might decline a second helping of dessert. That night, I lay awake thinking about the expression on Sarah's face when she looked at my grandmother's pearls. It wasn't just disinterested, it was something closer to disdain, as if the very idea of wearing something with family history and tradition was distasteful to her. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that Sarah was just a young woman with her own sense of style, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't just rejected the necklace, she had rejected everything it represented about our family, our values, and our desire to welcome her into our legacy. The pearl necklace incident should have been my wake-up call, but I was determined to bridge the gap between Sarah and our family traditions. I told myself that cultural differences were natural, and that with patience and understanding, we could find common ground. What I didn't anticipate was how deeply Sarah's dismissive attitudes would cut into the very foundation of who I am. "You see, my heritage isn't just background noise in my life, it's woven into everything I do, every value I hold dear." My parents immigrated from South Korea in the 1960s. Bringing with them a deep reverence for family, respect for elders, and traditions that had sustained their families for generations. They worked tirelessly to build a life here while maintaining the cultural practices that connected us to our ancestry. Growing up, I learned that honoring your parents and elders wasn't just polite, it was fundamental to maintaining family harmony and ensuring that wisdom passed from one generation to the next. My mother taught me the importance of the tea ceremony, not as an empty ritual, but as a way of showing respect, creating space for meaningful conversation, and acknowledging the dignity of every person in our family. When Michael and I married, he embraced these traditions with genuine enthusiasm. He learned to participate in our ceremonies, understood the significance of offering tea to elders, and even helped me teach David the proper way to show respect to his grandparents. After Michael died, these traditions became even more important to me. They were a way of keeping his memory alive and ensuring that David understood the depth of his cultural heritage. So when I invited Sarah over for what I hoped would be a meaningful cultural exchange, I was genuinely excited to share this important part of my identity with her. I had prepared my mother's ceremonial tea set, a beautiful porcelain set with delicate blue and white patterns that had been passed down through 3 generations. The teapot, cups, and serving tray were arranged on a silk cloth, and I had prepared traditional Korean sweets to accompany the tea. I explained to Sarah that the tea ceremony was a way of showing respect and creating a peaceful space for conversation. I demonstrated the proper way to hold the cup, how to receive tea with both hands as a sign of respect, and the gentle bowing that accompanies the ritual. I was sharing something sacred with her, something that represented centuries of wisdom about building relationships and honoring family connections. Sarah watched the demonstration with what I initially thought was polite interest, but as I continued explaining the significance of each gesture, her expression began to change. She started glancing at her phone, tapping her fingers on the table, and eventually let out a small laugh that made my stomach drop. "Ruth, this is really sweet," she said, her voice carrying a tone that made the word sweet sound condescending. "But don't you think all these rituals are a bit outdated? I mean, it's just tea, right? Do we really need all this ceremony just to have a conversation?" I felt my face flush with embarrassment and something deeper, a protective anger rising in my chest. "It's not just about the tea," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's about showing respect for each other, for our family, for the generations who came before us. These traditions have meaning." Sarah picked up one of the teacups, examining it with casual disinterest. "I'm sure they meant something back in the day, but we don't really need all these formal rules anymore, do we? Can't we just be natural with each other?" The phrase "back in the day" felt like a slap. These weren't museum pieces or historical curiosities, they were living traditions that connected me to my mother, my grandmother, and the long line of women who had found strength and wisdom in these practices. They were part of who I am, not relics to be discarded in favor of being natural. I tried one more time to bridge the gap. Sarah, I understand that these traditions might seem formal to you, but they're important to our family. When you marry David, you're not just marrying him, you're joining a family with its own history and values. I hoped you might want to understand where we come from. Sarah set down the teacup with a slight clatter that made me wince. Ruth, I appreciate that you have your traditions, but I'm not really interested in playing dress-up with old customs. David and I are building our own life together, and we'll create our own traditions. We don't need to be bound by what people did 50 years ago. The words hit me like a physical blow. Playing dress-up, as if my culture, my heritage, my most deeply held values were nothing more than a costume to be put on and discarded at will. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I forced myself to remain composed. Of course, I said quietly, beginning to clear away the tea set. I understand. But I didn't understand. I couldn't comprehend how someone could so casually dismiss something that meant so much to the family she was about to join. How could she expect to be welcomed into our family while showing such obvious disdain for everything that made us who we are? As I carefully packed away my mother's tea set, wrapping each piece in tissue paper, I realized that Sarah's rejection of our traditions wasn't just a matter of personal preference. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what marriage and family mean. She saw joining our family as David's wife, not as becoming part of something larger than herself. The conversation that followed was stilted and uncomfortable. Sarah made small talk about work and wedding planning, but I could barely focus on her words. I kept thinking about my mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier, and how heartbroken she would have been to see her tea set dismissed so callously. I thought about my grandmother, who had taught me that respect for family traditions was respect for the people who came before us. That evening, after Sarah left, I sat in my living room holding one of the teacups, running my fingers over the smooth porcelain. I thought about all the conversations that had taken place over this tea set, all the wisdom that had been shared, all the relationships that had been strengthened through the simple act of sitting together with respect and intention. I realized then that my attempts to be the perfect mother-in-law were actually erasing the very things that made me who I am. In my eagerness to avoid conflict, I was allowing Sarah to dismiss not just my traditions, but my identity itself. And worse, I was watching my son, the boy I had raised to respect his heritage, stand by in silence, while his fiancée mocked the values that had shaped our family for generations. The question that haunted me that night was this: how do you welcome someone into your family when they've made it clear they have no interest in being part of what makes your family special? How do you show love and acceptance to someone who shows neither love nor acceptance for you? I didn't have answers yet, but I was beginning to understand that being a good mother-in-law didn't mean erasing myself to make Sarah comfortable. It meant finding a way to maintain my dignity and values while still supporting my son's happiness. The challenge was figuring out how to do both when those two goals seemed increasingly incompatible. Despite the growing tension between Sarah and me, I was determined to contribute meaningfully to David and Sarah's wedding. After all, this was my only child's wedding, and I wanted it to be perfect for him, regardless of how his fiancée felt about our family traditions. I decided to focus on what I could control, providing generous financial support and practical assistance that would help them create the wedding of their dreams. The first step was sitting down with my financial advisor to determine how much I could realistically contribute without jeopardizing my own retirement security. As a successful real estate agent, I'd been fortunate to build a comfortable nest egg over the years, and I'd always planned to help David with major life events. After careful consideration, I decided I could contribute $15,000 to their wedding, fund a substantial amount that would allow them to upgrade from their modest budget to something truly special. Spent my evenings researching wedding venues, photographers, and caterers in their price range, then creating detailed spreadsheets that showed how my contribution could maximize their options. I found a beautiful lakeside venue that was normally out of their budget but would be perfect with my additional funding. I identified photographers whose work was stunning but affordable, and I compiled a list of caterers known for both quality and value. My wedding budget spreadsheet became a work of art in itself. I color-coded different categories of expenses, included vendor contact information, and even created a timeline that showed when deposits needed to be paid and when final decisions had to be made. I researched everything from flowers to music to transportation, always looking for ways to stretch their budget and create maximum impact. When I presented the spreadsheet to David and Sarah, along with my offer to contribute $15,000, I expected gratitude and excitement. Instead, I got something that felt more like relief mixed with entitlement. "Oh, thank goodness," Sarah said, scanning the spreadsheet. I was starting to panic about how we were going to afford everything I wanted. "This will help so much." She didn't thank me directly, but rather seemed to view my contribution as a problem being solved rather than a generous gift being offered. David was more appreciative, hugging me and expressing genuine gratitude for my support. But even he seemed to take my contribution somewhat for granted, as if it were expected rather than extraordinary. I reminded myself that they were young and probably didn't fully understand the magnitude of what I was offering, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my generosity was being treated as an obligation rather than a gift. What bothered me more was how quickly my financial contribution transformed from an offer of help into a source of assumptions and expectations. Within days, Sarah was making comments like, "Since Ruth is covering the venue, we can spend more on the dress, and with Ruth's money, we don't have to worry about the photographer's overtime fees." I started receiving text messages from Sarah, with links to wedding dresses that cost 3 times what she'd originally budgeted, with messages like, "What do you think? We can afford this now." When I gently suggested that my contribution was meant to enhance their overall celebration rather than fund specific splurges, she seemed genuinely confused. "But Ruth, you said you wanted to help make our wedding special," she replied. "This dress would make me feel so beautiful and special on my wedding day. Isn't that what you want?" The emotional manipulation was subtle but unmistakable. She was using my own words, my desire to make their wedding special, to justify expenses that went far beyond reasonable. When I tried to explain that my contribution came with the expectation of financial responsibility, she made me feel like I was being selfish and controlling. Even more concerning was how my input on wedding planning decisions was simultaneously dismissed and demanded. Sarah would reject my suggestions about venues, decorations, or menu options, often with comments about my taste being too traditional or not really our style. But when it came to practical matters like negotiating with vendors or understanding contract terms, suddenly my expertise was essential. "Ruth, you're so good at this business stuff," she'd say when she needed help reading vendor contracts or negotiating payment terms. "Can you handle the details with the caterer? I just want to focus on the creative aspects." My real estate background had given me strong negotiation skills and contract reading abilities, and Sarah was happy to take advantage of that expertise, while simultaneously dismissing my creative input. The pattern became clear. My money was welcome, my business skills were useful, but my opinions and preferences were irrelevant. I was being treated like a walking ATM with a side business in vendor management, not like a mother-in-law whose involvement in the wedding planning was an honor and a privilege. The most painful realization was that my son seemed oblivious to this dynamic. When I mentioned to David that I felt like my contributions were being taken for granted, he brushed off my concerns with comments like, "Sarah's just excited, Mom, and you know how stressful wedding planning can be." But I knew the difference between stress and disrespect. I understood that wedding planning was overwhelming and that emotions ran high during engagement periods. What I was experiencing wasn't the normal friction of family members learning to work together, it was the systematic devaluation of my role in my son's life. I began to suspect that Sarah's vision of our family dynamic was one where I provided financial support and practical assistance while staying quietly in the background, never voicing opinions or expectations that might conflict with her preferences. She wanted a mother-in-law who wrote checks and handled logistics, not one who brought her own ideas, traditions, and emotional investment to the relationship. The wedding planning process was revealing something troubling about Sarah's character and my son's willingness to stand up for me. I was being asked to invest significant money and energy in an event where my preferences were consistently dismissed and my contributions were treated as obligations rather than gifts. As I updated my spreadsheet for the third time that week, adding new expenses that Sarah had decided were essential to their perfect day, I realized I was funding a wedding that reflected none of my values, honored none of my traditions, and seemed designed to erase rather than celebrate my role in David's life. The question that kept me awake at night was whether I was being a generous mother-in-law or a foolish enabler. Was I supporting my son's happiness, or was I teaching both him and Sarah that my feelings, preferences, and dignity were worth less than their wedding day fantasies? The breaking point came on a sunny Saturday afternoon that I had been looking forward to for weeks. Sarah had finally agreed to include me in a bridal party gathering at my house, and I was determined to make it a positive experience for everyone involved. I spent the morning preparing refreshments, arranging flowers, and setting up my dining room as a creative workspace where we could work on wedding invitations together. I was genuinely excited about this opportunity. Wedding invitations are more than just pieces of paper. They're the first glimpse guests get of a couple's style and the tone they want to set for their celebration. I had researched invitation trends, gathered samples of different paper stocks and printing techniques, and even sketched out several design concepts that I thought might appeal to Sarah's modern aesthetic, while incorporating some classic elements. The bridal party arrived around 2 o'clock. Sarah's sister Monica, her college roommate Jessica, her coworker Amanda, and her childhood friend Brittany. These were the women who would stand beside her on her wedding day, and I was honored to be included in their planning session. I had met them all briefly at various engagement events, but this was my first opportunity to really spend time with them, and hopefully build some meaningful connections. I had prepared what I thought was an elegant invitation design that balanced contemporary clean lines with traditional elements. The layout was sophisticated but not stuffy, featuring beautiful typography and a subtle floral border that complemented the lakeside venue they had chosen. I had researched the couple's story, their shared interests, and even incorporated a small graphic element that referenced the hiking trail where David had proposed. "Ladies," I said, unveiling my design concept with genuine pride, "I've been working on some invitation ideas that I thought might capture the essence of David and Sarah's love story." I spread the mock-ups across the dining room table, along with paper samples, font options, and envelope designs. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Sarah picked up one of the designs, held it at arm's length for about 3 seconds, and then set it down with a dismissive sigh. "Oh, Ruth," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that I was beginning to recognize and dread, "this is so traditional. It's like something my grandmother would have chosen." The other bridesmaids gathered around the table, examining my designs with expressions that ranged from polite confusion to barely concealed amusement. I felt my cheeks begin to burn, but I tried to maintain my composure and explain my design choices. "I was trying to create something elegant and timeless," I said, pointing to specific elements of the design. "The typography is actually quite contemporary, and I thought the floral elements would tie in beautifully with your color scheme. Plus, I included that little mountain silhouette to reference where David proposed." "Mountains," Sarah interrupted, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Ruth, we're not having a hiking-themed wedding. This whole design is just so boring, so old-fashioned. It's like you don't understand what we want at all." The eye roll was bad enough, but it was her next words that shattered something inside me. "Honestly," she said, turning to her bridesmaids with a laugh that excluded me completely, "David's mom is just too traditional for our wedding. She wants everything to be so formal and stuffy. I keep trying to explain that we want something modern and fun, but she just doesn't get it." The room fell silent. The bridesmaids looked uncomfortable, glancing between Sarah and me with expressions that suggested they recognized they were witnessing something awkward and potentially hurtful. But Sarah seemed oblivious to the impact of her words, continuing to flip through my designs with obvious disdain. "Too traditional," the phrase echoed in my mind as I stood there, surrounded by the women who were supposed to become my extended family, feeling completely humiliated and dismissed. I had spent hours working on these designs, researching their preferences, trying to create something that honored both their style and the significance of the occasion. And Sarah had just dismissed my efforts as irrelevant and outdated in front of the most important women in her life. I excused myself to the kitchen, ostensibly to refill the refreshment tray, but really to collect myself and fight back the tears that were threatening to spill over. As I stood at my kitchen counter, gripping the edge of the granite surface, I could hear the bridesmaids' voices from the dining room. "Sarah," I heard Monica say quietly, "that was kind of harsh. She obviously put a lot of work into those designs." "I'm just being honest," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly into the kitchen. "I can't pretend to love something just to spare her feelings. This is my wedding, and I want everything to be perfect. If that means hurting Ruth's feelings, then so be it. The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. If that means hurting Ruth's feelings, then so be it. As if my feelings were an acceptable casualty in her quest for the perfect wedding, as if the time, effort, and love I had invested in trying to be part of her special day were worth nothing. I returned to the dining room with a forced smile, carrying a fresh tray of pastries and trying to pretend I hadn't heard their conversation. The bridesmaids looked at me with expressions that ranged from sympathy to embarrassment, but Sarah seemed completely unaware that she had said anything hurtful. "So," I said, my voice carefully controlled, "what kind of design direction were you thinking of instead?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed me a collection of invitation designs she had saved on Pinterest. They were aggressively modern stark white backgrounds with minimal black text, geometric shapes instead of traditional borders, and fonts that looked more appropriate for a tech conference than a wedding. There was nothing warm, nothing romantic, nothing that suggested celebration or joy. "This is more our style," she said. "Clean, modern, sophisticated. Not cluttered with all those unnecessary decorative elements." I looked at the designs she preferred and felt a deep sadness wash over me. These invitations could have been for any couple, announcing any event. There was nothing personal about them, nothing that reflected David's personality or their shared story. They were as cold and impersonal as Sarah's treatment of me. But what hurt most was realizing that Sarah hadn't just rejected my design ideas, she had rejected the very concept of including me in the creative process. She had no interest in my input, my preferences, or my desire to contribute something meaningful to their wedding. She wanted me to provide financial support and handle logistics, but she wanted my actual involvement to be invisible. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of stilted conversation and forced politeness. I helped them research printing companies and timeline logistics, but I didn't offer any more creative suggestions. I had learned my lesson. My role was to be useful, not creative, practical, not personal. As the bridesmaids prepared to leave, a few of them made kind comments about my house and thanked me for hosting. Monica even quietly apologized for the awkwardness, which made me realize that Sarah's behavior had been as obvious to everyone else as it had been painful to me. But Sarah herself left without any acknowledgement of how her words had affected me. She kissed my cheek and said, "Thanks for letting us use your space, Ruth. We'll take it from here," on the invitations. After they left, I sat in my dining room, surrounded by the invitation designs I had worked so hard to create. Each mock-up represented hours of thought and effort, each design element carefully chosen to honor both tradition and their personal style, and all of it had been dismissed as too traditional in a matter of seconds. That evening, I realized that the invitation incident was about much more than wedding stationery. It was about respect, inclusion, and the fundamental question of what role I was supposed to play in my son's life going forward. Sarah had made it clear that she saw me as a service provider rather than a family member, someone whose contributions were valuable only when they aligned perfectly with her vision. The phrase "too traditional" kept echoing in my mind, but I was beginning to understand that it wasn't really about my design aesthetic. It was about me, my values, my heritage, my desire to be meaningfully included in my son's life. In Sarah's world, all of that was just too traditional to matter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my king-sized bed, the one Michael and I had shared for so many years, staring at the ceiling and replaying Sarah's words over and over in my mind. Too traditional, the phrase had become a weapon, used to dismiss everything I offered, everything I valued, everything I represented in David's life. I got up around 3 in the morning and walked to my home office, where my banking statement lay open on the desk. There it was, in black and white. The $15,000 withdrawal I had made just 2 days earlier, intended for their wedding gift. The money was sitting in a special account, waiting to be presented to them at the rehearsal dinner in a beautiful card I had already purchased. $15,000. It represented months of careful financial planning, overtime hours showing houses to difficult clients, weekends spent working instead of relaxing. I had earned every penny of that money through hard work and discipline, and I had been genuinely excited to give it to them as a symbol of my love and support for their marriage. But as I sat there in the darkness, I began to think about what that money really represented and what my gift would actually accomplish. The truth was harsh, but undeniable. Sarah didn't want my involvement in her wedding, except as a source of funding. She had made it clear that my opinions, my traditions, my values, and my feelings were irrelevant to her vision of their perfect day. I was being asked to finance a celebration that actively excluded me in every meaningful way. I thought about my late husband Michael and what he would say if he were here. Michael had always been a man of principle, someone who believed that respect was earned through actions, not bought with money. He had taught David to stand up for what was right, to defend the people he loved, and to never let anyone treat his family with disrespect. But David wasn't defending me, my son, the boy I had raised alone for 8 years, the young man I had supported through college and career challenges. The person I loved most in the world was standing by silently while his fiancée systematically dismissed and humiliated me. I remembered the conversation we'd had just a week earlier, when I had gently mentioned to David that I felt excluded from wedding planning decisions. His response had been dismissive and painful. "Mom, you're being too sensitive. Sarah's just stressed about the wedding. She doesn't mean anything by it." Too sensitive. Another phrase designed to make me question my own perceptions and feelings. I was supposed to accept being treated with disrespect because pointing it out made me too sensitive. I was supposed to smile and write checks while being told that everything I offered was wrong, outdated, or unwanted. As I sat in my office, I thought about the years after Michael's death, when David and I had grown so close. I remembered helping him through his grief, supporting him through college, celebrating his achievements, and building the kind of mother-son relationship that I thought would last a lifetime. I had been his anchor, his champion, his safe harbor when the world felt overwhelming. But now, when I needed him to stand up for me, to defend me against his fiancée's disrespect, he was choosing her side without question. He was allowing her to treat me poorly because it was easier than confronting her behavior. He was prioritizing his desire to avoid conflict over his responsibility to protect his mother's dignity. The realization broke my heart, but it also clarified something important. I had been enabling this dynamic by accepting it. Every time I swallowed my hurt feelings to keep the peace, every time I made excuses for Sarah's behavior, every time one provided financial support despite being treated poorly, I was teaching both of them that my feelings didn't matter. I opened my laptop and looked at my bank account again. The $15,000 was sitting there, waiting to be gifted to a couple who had shown me no respect, no gratitude, and no consideration. I was about to give a substantial amount of money to people who had made it clear that they valued my contributions, but not my presence, my money, but not my opinions, my usefulness, but not my dignity. That's when I made my decision. I walked to my bedroom and retrieved the beautiful wedding card. I had purchased cream-colored with elegant gold lettering that said, "Congratulations on your wedding day." Inside, I had written a heartfelt message about love, commitment, and family. Banza had planned to tuck the $15,000 check inside this card and present it to them at the rehearsal dinner. Instead, I took the check out of the card and held it in my hands. $15,000, a small fortune that could have given them the wedding of their dreams, allowed them to upgrade every aspect of their celebration, and provided a financial foundation for starting their married life. I thought about Sarah's eye roll, her dismissive comments about my traditions, her casual cruelty when she said that hurting my feelings was acceptable if it meant getting what she wanted. I thought about David's failure to defend me, his willingness to dismiss my concerns as oversensitivity, and then I tore up the check. I didn't rip it quickly in anger or frustration. I tore it slowly, deliberately, thinking about each piece as it separated from the whole. This piece represented the lakeside venue they wanted. This piece represented the upgraded photographer. This piece represented the open bar they had planned. This piece represented their assumption that my money came without conditions or expectations of respect. As the pieces fell into my wastepaper basket, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For months, I had been twisting myself into knots, trying to be the perfect mother-in-law, suppressing my own values and preferences to avoid conflict. I had been funding a wedding that celebrated everything I disagreed with while ignoring everything I held dear. But by tearing up that check, I was reclaiming my dignity and my right to be treated with respect. I was sending a message that my love and support came with conditions based at human decency and consideration for my feelings. I wasn't canceling my gift out of spite or revenge. I was canceling it out of self-respect. I was teaching David and Sarah a lesson that I should have taught them months ago, that generosity is a privilege, not a right, and that people who want to benefit from your love and support need to treat you with basic respect. The wedding was still 6 weeks away. They would have time to adjust their budget, scale back their plans, and figure out how to pay for the celebration they wanted without my contribution. It would be inconvenient and disappointing, but it wouldn't be catastrophic. What would be catastrophic would be continuing to enable a dynamic where my feelings and dignity were considered acceptable casualties in their pursuit of the perfect wedding. What would be catastrophic would be teaching them that disrespect could be purchased for $15,000. As I got ready for bed, I felt lighter than I had in months. I had stopped being a victim of their poor treatment and had become an active participant in defining how I would be treated going forward. The torn check pieces in my wastepaper basket weren't just destroyed money, they were the remnants of a relationship dynamic that I was no longer willing to accept. Tomorrow, I would have to face the consequences of my decision. David and Sarah would be angry, hurt, and probably confused. But tonight, for the first time in months, I was sleeping as a woman who valued herself enough to demand respect from the people she loved. The phone call came at 7:30. The next morning, I was in my kitchen, enjoying my first cup of coffee and feeling surprisingly peaceful about my decision from the night before. When my phone rang with David's name on the caller ID, I knew this conversation was coming, but I wasn't prepared for the anger in his voice. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" His words hit me like a slap. David rarely cursed, especially not at me, and the hostility in his tone told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to unfold. "Good morning, David," I said calmly, settling into my breakfast nook chair. "I assume Sarah told you about my decision regarding the wedding gift." "Your decision?" His voice was incredulous. "Mom, you can't just cancel a $15,000 gift because you had your feelings hurt. That's not how families work." The phrase "had your feelings hurt" made my chest tighten. He was minimizing what had happened, reducing months of disrespect and dismissal to a simple case of oversensitivity on my part. But I had expected this reaction, and I was prepared for it. "David, this isn't about hurt feelings," I said, keeping my voice steady and calm. "This is about respect. Your fiancée has made it clear that while she values my financial contributions, she has no interest in my opinions, my traditions, or my presence in your wedding planning. I've decided that I won't fund a celebration where I'm not truly welcome." "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "Of course, you're welcome. You're my mother." "Sarah never said you weren't welcome. Sarah said I was too traditional for your wedding." "David," she rolled her eyes at me in front of her entire bridal party and dismissed months of work I'd done on invitation designs. "She's rejected every tradition I've tried to share, every suggestion I've made, and every attempt I've made to be included in meaningful way." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when David spoke again, his voice was defensive rather than angry. "Look, Mom, Sarah's just really particular about her vision for the wedding. It's not personal. She's like that with everyone." "No, David, she's not like that with everyone. She's like that with me, and more importantly, you're like that with me too." When she dismissed my invitation designs yesterday, where were you? When she mocked our family traditions, where were you? When she makes me feel unwelcome in my own son's life, where are you? "I can't be in the middle of every little disagreement between you two," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I'm trying to keep the peace by sacrificing your mother's dignity." I asked quietly, "David, your father would be ashamed of how you're allowing me to be treated. He taught you to stand up for your family, to defend the people you love, but you're choosing the path of least resistance instead of doing what's right." The mention of his father seemed to hit home. David's voice became quieter, more uncertain. "Mom, that's not fair. Dad's been gone for 8 years. You can't use his memory to manipulate me." "I'm not manipulating you, son. I'm reminding you of the values he taught us both: respect for family, standing up for what's right, not allowing people to treat the ones you love poorly just because it's convenient." "Sarah doesn't treat you poorly," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's just different from our family. She has her own way of doing things." "David, let me ask you something. In the months since you've been engaged, can you think of a single time when Sarah has shown genuine appreciation for anything I've offered? Can you remember her ever asking about our family history, our traditions, or what's important to me? Can you recall her expressing any interest in being part of our family rather than just married to you?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I wondered if he had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and defeated. "She's not like you, Mom. She doesn't do all the family stuff and traditions. That doesn't mean she doesn't care." "What does it mean, then?" I asked gently, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like she wants all the benefits of marrying into our family: financial support, help with logistics, access to my business connections without any of the responsibilities that come with being part of a family. "That's not true," he said, but his protest sounded weak. "David, show me your text messages with Sarah from yesterday after the bridal party meeting." "What? Why would I?" "Because I want you to see how she talks about me when I'm not around. I want you to see the person you're choosing to defend over your own mother." There was another long pause. When David spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't do that, Mom, because you know what I'll find, don't you? You know that she complains about me, mocks our traditions, and treats me like an inconvenience rather than family. And you know that you've been agreeing with her instead of defending me. Mom, please." His voice cracked slightly. "Don't make me choose between you and Sarah." "I'm not making you choose, David. You already chose. You chose her comfort over my dignity. You chose avoiding conflict over standing up for what's right. You chose to prioritize someone who's been in your life for 2 years over the mother who raised you alone for 8 years after your father died." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear David breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel his internal struggle as he tried to process what I was saying. "The $15,000 isn't gone forever," I continued, my voice gentle but firm. "It's still sitting in my account, but it will stay there until I see evidence that both you and Sarah understand that respect is a prerequisite for generosity. That being part of our family means honoring what our family values, not just taking what our family can provide." "This is going to ruin everything," he said finally, his voice full of panic. "The wedding, our relationship, our family. Sarah is going to be devastated. Her parents will think we can't afford the wedding we promised them." "David, listen to yourself. You're more worried about what Sarah's parents will think than you are about how your own mother has been treated. You're more concerned about funding a party than you are about the relationships that are supposed to last long after the wedding is over." "That's not true," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then prove it," I said simply. "Show me that our relationship matters more than my bank account. Show me that you can stand up to Sarah when she treats me poorly. Show me that the values your father and I taught you still mean something to you." "I don't know how to do that without causing a huge fight with Sarah," he admitted. "Sometimes, David, fights are necessary. Sometimes standing up for what's right requires discomfort and conflict. Your father understood that. I thought I had taught you to understand it too." When David finally hung up, he didn't say goodbye or promise to call back. He simply ended the call, leaving me sitting in my kitchen with my now cold coffee and the weight of a relationship that might never be the same. But as I sat there processing our conversation, I realized something important. David knew I was right. His inability to defend Sarah's behavior, his reluctance to show me their text messages, his panic about the canceled gift, all of it confirmed what I had suspected. He knew that Sarah treated me poorly, and he knew that he had been enabling it. The question now was whether he loved me enough to do something about it, or whether he would choose the easier path of continuing to appease his fiancée at my expense. Either way, I had drawn my line in the sand. The choice was his to make. Word travels fast in families, especially when there's drama to discuss. By that afternoon, my phone was buzzing with calls and messages from relatives who had heard various versions of what had happened between David, Sarah, and me. The family group chat that usually contained mundane updates about work and weekend plans had exploded into a battlefield of opinions about my decision to cancel the wedding gift. The first call came from my sister Jennifer, David's beloved aunt, who had helped me raise him after Michael's death. Jennifer had always been my closest confidant, the person who understood both my struggles as a single mother and my deep love for my son. "Ruth, honey, I just got off the phone with David," she said, her voice gentle but concerned. "He's pretty upset about the wedding gift situation. Do you want to tell me what really happened?" I appreciated that Jennifer asked for my side of the story rather than immediately taking David's version as fact. I walked her through the months of escalating disrespect, from Sarah's rejection of the pearl, necklace to her mockery of our cultural traditions, to her dismissive treatment during the invitation planning session. She called me to traditional in front of her entire bridal party. Jen, not just my ideas, me. As if everything I am, everything our family represents, is just outdated baggage that she has to tolerate to marry David. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. Ruth, I've been watching this dynamic unfold for months, and I have to say, I've been concerned too. At the engagement dinner, when Sarah rejected grandmother's necklace, I could see how much that hurt you. And David just sat there like it was perfectly normal for his fiancée to dismiss a family heirloom. You noticed that too, honey. Everyone noticed. Maria, Sarah's own mother, looked embarrassed by her daughter's behavior. When someone offers you a family heirloom, you accept it graciously even if you don't plan to wear it. Sarah acted like you were trying to force her into an ugly dress. Jennifer's validation meant everything to me. I had started to wonder if I was being overly sensitive, if my expectations were unreasonable. But Jennifer had witnessed the same behavior and drawn the same conclusions. I support your decision about the money, she continued. $15,000 is a significant gift, and respect should come with it. If Sarah wants to be part of our family, she needs to understand that families have traditions, values, and feelings that matter. But not everyone in the family shared Jennifer's perspective. My cousin Patricia called an hour later with a very different message. Ruth, I think you're making a huge mistake, she said without preamble. David is your only child, and you're risking your relationship with him over wedding planning disagreements. Is your pride really worth potentially losing your son? Patricia, this isn't about pride, it's about respect. Sometimes we have to swallow our pride for the sake of family harmony, she replied. Young people do things differently now. Sarah isn't trying to hurt you, she just has her own style. You're taking this too personally. The conversation with Patricia was painful because I could hear echoes of my own doubts in her words. Was I being too rigid? Was I prioritizing my hurt feelings over my relationship with David? Was I making a mountain out of a molehill? But then my nephew Marcus called, and his perspective reminded me why I had made this decision in the first place. Aunt Ruth, I just wanted to say that I think you're doing the right thing, he said. I've been watching how Sarah treats you at family events, and it's not okay. She acts like she's doing us all a favor by being there, like our family isn't good enough for her. Marcus was 25, close to David and Sarah's age, so his opinion carried particular weight. If someone from their generation could see the disrespect in Sarah's behavior, then I wasn't imagining things or being overly traditional. At the last barbecue, Marcus continued, when you were telling the story about great-grandmother's immigration journey, Sarah was literally rolling her eyes and checking her phone. She has no interest in our family history, our culture, or, honestly, anything about us except what we can do for her. The family group chat was even more revealing than the individual phone calls. I rarely participated in the group messaging, preferring phone calls for meaningful conversations, but Jennifer had added me to see what people were saying. The messages showed just how divided the family had become. My cousin Linda wrote, Ruth is being way too dramatic. It's just wedding planning stress. She should be the bigger person and give them the money anyway. But David's godfather, Tom, responded, since when does being the bigger person mean accepting disrespect? Ruth has been incredibly generous and patient. There has to be a line somewhere. My Aunt Helen chimed in, I've been married for 40 years, and I learned early that you have to choose your battles within. Not every hill is worth dying on. Jennifer's response was swift and pointed. This isn't about choosing battles. This is about a young woman who shows no respect for her future husband's family and a son who won't defend his mother. Some hills are worth dying on. The messages kept coming throughout the afternoon, each family member weighing in with their opinion about my decision. Some supported me, others criticized me, and a few tried to find middle ground by suggesting compromises that missed the point entirely. But it was the messages I wasn't seeing that concerned me most. Jennifer later told me that there was a separate group chat, one that didn't include me, where the conversation was much more heated. Apparently, Sarah had been texting family members directly, sharing her version of events and positioning herself as the victim of an unreasonable mother-in-law. She's telling people that you're trying to control their wedding and that you're jealous of her relationship with David, Jennifer reported. She's saying that you've been difficult from the beginning and that she's tried everything to make you happy. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Sarah was rewriting the entire narrative, transforming months of her disrespectful behavior into a story. where she was the patient victim and I was the controlling villain. And based on some of the family responses, her version was gaining traction. The worst part, Jennifer continued, is that David isn't correcting any of it. He's letting Sarah tell her side of the story, without providing any context about how she's actually treated you. He's allowing his own family to believe that his mother is being unreasonable and controlling. That revelation hurt more than Sarah's manipulation. I could understand why Sarah would try to control the narrative. She was protecting herself and her relationship. But David's silence felt like a betrayal. He was allowing his family to judge me based on incomplete and biased information, rather than standing up for me or providing the full context of what had transpired. The family division was creating stress and tension that extended far beyond my relationship with David and Sarah. Cousins were taking sides, aunts and uncles were arguing, and what should have been a joyous time of wedding preparation had become a source of family conflict. But in the midst of all the chaos and disagreement, one thing became crystal clear. I was not alone in recognizing Sarah's problematic behavior. The family members who supported my decision weren't just being loyal to me, they were responding to months of observations about Sarah's attitude toward our family, our traditions, and our values. The split in family opinion wasn't really about whether I should have canceled the wedding gift. It was about two different philosophies of family relationships. Some relatives believed that keeping the peace was more important than addressing disrespect. Others believed that respect was a fundamental requirement for healthy family relationships. I went to bed that night, my phone still buzzing with family messages. I realized that my decision had forced everyone to choose sides. The conflict was no longer just between Sarah and MIT, had become a referendum on what kind of behavior our family would accept and what standards we would maintain. The question now was whether David would recognize that his silence was allowing his fiancée to divide his family, or whether he would continue to prioritize avoiding conflict over preserving relationships. Either way, the damage was already done. The family dynamics had shifted, and things would never be quite the same, regardless of how the wedding situation ultimately resolved. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a strange kind of limbo. David and I maintained minimal contacts, tilted text messages about logistics, and brief, uncomfortable phone calls that avoided the elephant in the room. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to be conducting a campaign to prove that the wedding could be just as spectacular without my financial contribution. Posting, constant updates on social media about vendors, dress fittings, and last-minute preparations. I had made peace with my decision to attend the wedding despite everything that had transpired. This was my son's wedding day, and regardless of how his fiancée treated me or how disappointed I was in his failure to defend me, I wouldn't miss this milestone in his life. But I would attend on my own terms, with my dignity intact and my boundaries clearly established. The wedding seating chart, when it finally arrived by email, told me everything I needed to know about my place in their vision of family hierarchy. While Sarah's family occupied the first 3 rows on her side of the church, I had been relegated to the 4th row on David's side, seated behind his college friends and work colleagues. Jennifer, Tom, and Marcus had been placed in the row behind me, while more distant relatives filled the seats closer to the altar. The message was unmistakable. Despite being the mother of the groom, I was not considered an honored guest. The seating arrangement reflected Sarah's assessment of my importance in David's life. Significant enough to warrant an invitation, but not important enough to merit a place of honor. Even David's high school friends had been given better seats than his own mother. Jennifer was furious when she saw the seating chart. "This is intentionally hurtful," she told me during one of our daily check-in calls. "Sarah knows exactly what she's doing. She's literally putting you in your place, showing you how little she values your role in David's life." But I had moved, beyond anger, into a kind of sad acceptance. The seating chart was just another data point in the pattern of behavior I had been observing for months. Sarah's actions consistently demonstrated that she saw me as an obstacle to be managed, rather than a family member to be honored. The only surprise was that David had apparently approved this arrangement, further confirming his willingness to prioritize Sarah's comfort over his mother's dignity. 3 days before the wedding, I received a text from Sarah that perfectly encapsulated her approach to our relationship. "Ruth, I know things have been tense between us, but I hope we can put all that behind us for the wedding. David really wants his mom there, and I want him to be happy. Let's just focus on celebrating their day and worry about everything else later." The text was masterfully crafted to position her as the gracious peacemaker. While subtly reinforcing several hurtful messages, she framed my attendance as something David wanted rather than something she welcomed, making it clear that I was there for his sake, not because she valued my presence. She reduced months of disrespectful behavior to things being tense, as if we had simply had a minor disagreement rather than a fundamental conflict about respect and family values. Most tellingly, she referred to the wedding as their day rather than our family celebration, emphasizing that this was about David and Sarah as a couple rather than about joining two families together. The suggestion that we worry about everything else later implied that addressing the underlying issues was less important than maintaining the appearance of family harmony for the wedding photos. I didn't respond to the text. There was nothing to say that wouldn't either escalate the conflict or compromise my principles. Instead, I focused on preparing myself emotionally for what I knew would be a difficult day. My alternative wedding gift had taken weeks to plan and prepare. Instead of the $15,000 check they were expecting, I had created something that would serve as both a wedding present and a teaching moment. I had assembled a beautiful photo collage featuring pictures of David's childhood, my sacrifices as a single mother, and our family's journey together over the years. The centerpiece was a photo from David's college graduation, just the two of us, beaming with pride after he received his diploma. Below it, I had included a handwritten note explaining that the original gift had been a $15,000 contribution to their wedding fund, but that respect and gratitude were prerequisites for such generosity. The note concluded with my hope that they would build a marriage based on mutual respect, not just for each other, but for all the family members who loved and supported them. It wasn't a gift given in anger or spite. It was a gift designed to make them think about the relationship between generosity and respect, about the cost of taking family for granted, and about the difference between love that enables poor behavior and love that requires accountability. I had the photo collage, professionally framed and wrapped in elegant paper. To anyone observing from the outside, it would look like a thoughtful, personal wedding gift. Only David and Sarah would understand the deeper message it contained. The day before the wedding, I spent the morning at my salon getting my hair styled and my nails done. I had chosen my outfit weeks earlier, sophisticated navy dress with a matching jacket that was elegant enough for a formal wedding but understated enough to avoid upstaging the bride. I wanted to look beautiful and dignified, to carry myself with the grace that befitted the mother of the groom, regardless of how I had been treated. That evening, David called me for the first time since our heated conversation about the canceled gift. "Mom," he said, his voice tentative and tired, "I just wanted to make sure you're still planning to come tomorrow." "Of course I'm coming, David. It's your wedding day. I know things have been difficult between you and Sarah, and I know you're disappointed about everything, but I need you there. You're my mom, and it wouldn't be the same without you." The vulnerability in his voice almost broke my heart. This was my son, the little boy I had raised alone, the young man I had supported through every challenge and celebrated through every triumph. Despite everything that had happened, despite his failure to defend me and his choice to prioritize Sarah's feelings over mine, he was still my child. "I'll be there," I assured him. "I may not agree with how you've handled this situation, David, but I love you. I'll always love you." "I love you too, Mom," he said quietly. I hope after tomorrow we can figure out how to fix things between all of us." I wanted to tell him that fixing things would require Sarah to acknowledge her behavior and show genuine respect for our family. I wanted to explain that healing would depend on his willingness to stand up for me rather than just hoping the problems would resolve themselves. But this wasn't the time for that conversation. "We'll see," I said simply. "Let's just focus on getting through tomorrow." As I went to bed that night, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation. Tomorrow would be one of the most important days of my son's life, but it would also be a test of whether our relationship could survive the fundamental changes that marriage would bring. I would be watching David marry a woman who had shown little respect for me or our family values, and I would be doing so from the fourth row, with a gift that might either spark a long overdue conversation about respect or permanently damage our relationship. But I had made my peace with those possibilities. I would attend the wedding with my head held high, my dignity intact, and my principles uncompromised. Whatever happened next would be determined by David and Sarah's response to the lesson. I was about to teach them about the true cost of taking family love for granted. The morning of David's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden autumn light that photographers dream of. I woke early, having slept surprisingly well despite the emotional weight of the day ahead. There was something liberating about knowing exactly where I stood and what I planned to do. No more uncertainty. No more hoping for changes that weren't coming. I took my time getting ready, treating each step as a small ritual of self-care and preparation. The navy dress fit perfectly, sophisticated and elegant without being flashy. My jewelry was simple but beautiful, my own pearl earrings and a delicate gold necklace that Michael had given me for our 10th anniversary. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had weathered storms, made difficult decisions, and maintained her dignity through challenging circumstances. The wedding gift sat wrapped on my dining room table, the professional packaging giving no hint of the powerful message contained within. I had written my name clearly on the card, ensuring there would be no question about who had given this particular present. Inside my purse, I carried copies of the bank statements showing the $15,000 withdrawal and deposit, evidence of the gift that could have been, should anyone question my account of events. I arrived at St. Michael's Episcopal Church precisely 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Early enough to make a graceful entrance, but not so early that I would have to endure extended small talk with relatives who might want to rehash the family drama. My timing was deliberate. I wanted to be present and visible, but I didn't want to create unnecessary opportunities for conflict. The church looked absolutely beautiful. Sarah and her wedding planner had exquisite taste, I had to admit. White and gold decorations adorned every pew. Elegant floral arrangements flanked the altar, and soft lighting created an atmosphere of romance and celebration. Despite everything that had transpired between us, I felt a genuine moment of happiness for David. This was the wedding day he had dreamed of, and it was going to be memorable. As I walked down the aisle toward my assigned seat in the 4th row, I was acutely aware of the surprised reactions from family and friends. Several relatives did double takes, clearly uncertain about whether I would actually attend given the recent family tensions. I smiled graciously at everyone I passed, my demeanor calm and dignified despite the undercurrent of drama that seemed to follow me. Jennifer was already seated in the row behind mine, and she caught my eye with a subtle nod of support. Tom and Marcus were there too, along with several cousins who had expressed support for my position during the family controversy. It was comforting to know that I wasn't completely alone, even if I felt somewhat isolated by the seating arrangement. Sarah's family dominated the front rows on her side of the church. Her parents looked elegant and happy, clearly excited about their daughter's big day. Her sister Monica was bustling around with last-minute coordination, and various aunts, uncles, and cousins filled the pews with animated conversation and laughter. It was a stark contrast to the more subdued atmosphere on David's side, where the recent family conflict had created an undercurrent of tension. But the most telling reaction came from David's friends and colleagues, who were seated in the rows ahead of me. Several of them turned around when I arrived, their expressions showing surprise and concern. These were people who had known me for years, who remembered how I had supported David through college and early career challenges. They understood that something was seriously wrong if the mother of the groom was sitting behind them rather than in the front row. Mike Peterson, David's college roommate, actually got up from his seat and came back to greet me. "Mrs. Lee," he said warmly, "it's so good to see you. You look absolutely beautiful." He paused, glancing at the seating arrangement with obvious confusion. "Are you sure you're in the right place? I would have expected you to be up front." His question was innocent but pointed, and I could see other guests listening to our conversation with interest. This was exactly the kind of moment Sarah had probably hoped to avoid public attention to the awkward family dynamics that her seating decisions had created. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," I replied with a gracious smile. "Thank you for asking, though. It's wonderful to see you again." Mike looked like he wanted to say more, but he simply squeezed my hand and returned to his seat. The brief exchange had accomplished something important, though it had highlighted the unusual seating arrangement to people who cared about David and might have questions about why his mother wasn't being honored appropriately. As more guests arrived, I noticed several other small moments of recognition and surprise. David's high school friends, his work colleagues, even some of Sarah's extended family members, seemed puzzled by the seating dynamics. The mother of the groom, relegated to the fourth row, was unusual enough to generate whispered conversations and concerned glances. 10 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, Sarah's wedding coordinator approached me with a somewhat nervous expression. "Mrs. Lee," she said quietly, "I wanted to double-check that you're comfortable with your seating placement. I know sometimes families have special requests or changes at the last minute." The question was clearly motivated by the reactions she had observed from other guests. Sarah's carefully planned seating arrangement was creating exactly the kind of attention and speculation that she had probably hoped to avoid. "I'm perfectly comfortable," I assured her. "This is exactly where the bride wanted me to sit, and I'm happy to respect her wishes on her special day." My response was technically truthful, while subtly highlighting that the seating arrangement had been Sarah's choice, not mine. The coordinator looked relieved to have confirmation that I wasn't going to cause a scene, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she processed the implications of my response. The organ music began, signaling that the ceremony was about to start. I settled into my seat, opened the wedding program, and was struck by what I found, or rather, what I didn't find. While the program included detailed biographies of the wedding party, special thanks to various vendors and helpers, and even acknowledgments of deceased grandparents, there was no mention of my contributions to the wedding planning process, no recognition of my role in David's life, and no special note about the mother of the groom. It was as if I had been erased from the narrative of this celebration. Sarah had managed to plan a wedding that included my son but excluded me from any meaningful recognition or honor. The program was just another piece of evidence that this wedding was designed to celebrate Sarah's vision and priorities, with David's family treated as background players rather than honored. Participants. As the processional music began and the wedding party started their walk down the aisle, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in my son, who looked handsome and happy in his tuxedo; sadness about the relationship that had been damaged by months of conflict and misunderstanding; and a quiet determination to see this day through with grace and dignity. Regardless of how I had been treated, the ceremony was about to begin, and I was ready for whatever came next. The wedding ceremony itself was undeniably beautiful. As the processional music swelled and the wedding party began their walk down the aisle, I felt my heart catch in my throat despite everything that had transpired. This was my son's wedding day, the culmination of years of dreams and months of planning. The moment when David would promise to love and cherish another person for the rest of his life. Sarah's bridesmaids looked stunning in their dusty rose gowns, each carrying bouquets of white roses and eucalyptus. David's groomsmen were handsome in their navy suits, walking with the measured pace that had been rehearsed the night before. When David appeared at the altar, looking more mature and serious than I had ever seen him, I felt a surge of maternal pride that transcended all the recent conflict. He was so handsome in his charcoal gray tuxedo, his dark hair carefully styled, his expression a mixture of joy and nervous anticipation. For a moment, I could see the little boy who had held my hand through his father's funeral, the teenager who had needed reassurance before his first job interview, the young man who had called me crying when his first serious relationship ended. All of those versions of David were present in the man standing at the altar, waiting for his bride. When the bridal march began and everyone rose to their feet, I turned like all the other guests to watch Sarah's entrance. She was absolutely radiant. Her dress was a masterpiece of modern elegance, a fitted bodice with delicate beading that caught the light, flowing into a full skirt that seemed to float as she walked. Her veil was cathedral length, trailing behind her like a cloud, and her smile was luminous with happiness. Whatever my feelings about Sarah's treatment of me, I couldn't deny that she made a beautiful bride. More importantly, the expression on David's face as he watched her walk down the aisle was pure joy. His eyes filled with tears, his smile was radiant, and his whole body seemed to lean toward her, as if drawn by magnetic force. He loved her completely, and that love was written across every feature of his face. As Sarah passed my row, her eyes briefly met mine. For just a moment, I saw something that might have been uncertainty, or even regret, flicker across her expression. But then she looked away, focusing on David and the future they were about to commit to together. The ceremony itself followed traditional Episcopal liturgy, with readings that Sarah and David had chosen to reflect their vision of marriage. The pastor spoke about love, commitment, and the importance of building a life together based on mutual respect and shared values. The irony of those words wasn't lost on me, given the recent conflicts about respect and family values, but I tried to focus on the hope that maybe marriage would bring out better qualities in both of them when it came time for the vows. David spoke first. His voice was steady and clear as he promised to love Sarah through good times and bad, to honor and cherish her, to be her partner and best friend. His words were heartfelt and genuine, and I could see that he meant every syllable. This was the man I had raised capable of deep love, sincere commitment, and genuine emotion. Sarah's vows were equally beautiful, though I found myself listening for any acknowledgement of family, heritage, or the importance of respecting the people who had shaped David into the man she was marrying. Her focus was entirely on their relationship as a couple, their shared dreams for the future, and their commitment to building a life that reflected their values and priorities. There was nothing wrong with her words, but there was also nothing that suggested any understanding of marriage as the joining of families rather than just two individuals. During the exchange of rings, I thought about my own wedding day 28 years earlier. Michael and I had written vows that specifically mentioned our commitment to honoring each other's families, to carrying forward the traditions that had shaped us, and to building a marriage that strengthened rather than divided our family relationships. We had understood that we weren't just marrying each other, we were becoming part of each other's families, inheriting responsibilities and privileges that extended beyond our romantic relationship. But watching David and Sarah, I realized that their understanding of marriage was fundamentally different. They saw themselves as creating something entirely new, unbound by the expectations or traditions of their families. In some ways, that perspective was admirably suggested independence and self-determination, but it also explained why Sarah had felt comfortable dismissing our family values, and why David had struggled to balance his loyalty to me with his commitment to her. The pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and David kissed Sarah with such tenderness and joy that I felt tears spring to my eyes despite everything. This was my son's moment of happiness, and regardless of how the journey had unfolded, I was grateful to witness it. As the recessional music began, and the newly married couple walked back down the aisle together, David caught sight of me in the fourth row. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw a flicker of something regret, perhaps, or uncertainty about the choices that had led to our current estrangement. I smiled at him, a genuine expression of love and maternal pride, and mouthed the words, "I love you." His face brightened with relief and gratitude, and he mouthed, "I love you too," before continuing down the aisle with his new wife. The wedding party followed, and then the guests began to file out of the church for the reception. As I gathered my purse and the wrapped wedding gift, I realized that the ceremony had crystallized something important for me. Despite all the conflict and hurt feelings, David was still my son. He had made choices that disappointed me, and he had failed to defend me when I needed his support, but he was still the child I had raised and loved for 27 years. The question now was whether our relationship could survive the changes that marriage would bring, and whether David and Sarah would learn from the lessons I was about to teach them about respect, gratitude, and the true meaning of family love. That as I walked out of the church into the late afternoon sunshine, I felt a sense of completion about the ceremony itself. David was married now, officially beginning a new chapter of his life. What remained to be seen was whether that new chapter would include a meaningful relationship with the mother, who had loved and supported him through everything, or whether his marriage would mark the beginning of a permanent estrangement that could have been avoided with a little more respect and a lot more wisdom. The reception was held at the Riverside Country Club, a venue that would have been completely outside David and Sarah's budget without the financial contributions from both sets of parents. The ballroom was elegantly decorated with the same white and gold theme from the church, with round tables adorned with tall centerpieces of white roses and gold candles. Despite everything that had happened, I had to admire the beauty of what Sarah and her wedding planner had created. I found my assigned table 8. Naturally, neither close to the head table, nor in the coveted spots near the dance floor. I was seated with some of David's college friends and their spouses, people I had met over the years but didn't know intimately. It was a pleasant enough arrangement, and certainly better than being relegated to the distant relatives' table. But it was another reminder of my diminished status in this celebration, that as the cocktail hour progressed, I found myself in conversations that revealed just how much Sarah had been shaping the narrative about our family conflicts. Several guests made comments that suggested they had heard a very specific version of recent events, one that painted me as an overbearing mother-in-law who had difficulty accepting David's independence. "Ruth, I hope you and Sarah can work things out," said Janet Morrison, the wife of one of David's work colleagues. "David mentioned that the wedding planning has been stressful for everyone. I'm sure it's hard to step back and let the young couple make their own decisions." The comment was clearly well-intentioned, but it revealed that David had been discussing our conflicts with people outside the family, and that the version they were hearing emphasized my supposed difficulty with stepping back, rather than Sarah's disrespectful behavior. "Wedding planning can certainly be challenging," I replied diplomatically. "Everyone wants the day to be perfect, and sometimes that creates tension when people have different visions. But it was my conversation with David's college friends that proved most revealing. These were young men who had known me for years, who had spent weekends at my house during college breaks, who remembered how I had supported David through difficult times. Their perspective on recent events was quite different from what some other guests seemed to believe. "Mrs. Lee," said Tom Martinez, David's former roommate, "I have to ask, what's the deal with the seating arrangement today? It seems weird that you're not sitting with the immediate family." Before I could answer, his wife Karen jumped in. "And why are you sitting with us instead of at the parents' table? That doesn't seem right for the mother of the groom." Their questions opened a floodgate of observations from other people at the table. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had noticed the subtle ways I had been marginalized in this celebration. "I was surprised that you weren't mentioned in the ceremony program," added Lisa Chang, another college friend's wife. "Usually the parents are acknowledged, especially when they've been so involved in the planning process." "Were you involved in the planning?" asked Tom, looking confused. Because Sarah was telling everyone that she and David planned everything themselves, that they wanted to keep it simple and handle all the details on their own. The conversation was revealing in ways that were both validating and painful. These people had noticed the same things I had observed: the unusual marginalization of the mother of the groom, the absence of acknowledgement for my contributions, the strange dynamics that suggested family conflict beneath the surface of celebration. "Well," I said carefully, "every family handles wedding planning differently. Sarah had very specific ideas about what she wanted, and I respected her vision for their special day." But Tom wasn't satisfied with my diplomatic response. "Mrs. Lee, come on. We've known you for years. You're not the type of person to just sit back and let other people handle everything, especially when it comes to David. What really happened?" His direct question caught me off guard. These young people had known me during some of the most important years of David's life. They had seen me juggle single motherhood with a demanding career, watched me support David through academic and personal challenges, and witnessed the close relationship we had built after his father's death. They knew that my absence from the wedding planning process was completely out of character. Before I could decide how to respond, Jennifer appeared at our table with a concerned expression. "Ruth, honey, could I speak with you for a moment?" she asked. "There's something you need to know." I excused myself from the table and followed Jennifer to a quiet corner of the reception hall. Her face was serious, and I could tell that whatever she had to share wasn't going to be pleasant. "I just overheard a conversation between Sarah and some of her bridesmaids," Jennifer said quietly. "They were talking about you, and, well, it wasn't kind." My stomach tightened, but I wasn't entirely surprised. "What did they say?" "Sarah was complaining about how difficult you've been throughout the planning process. She told them that you tried to take over everything, that you pushed your outdated ideas on them, and that you threw a tantrum when they didn't use your suggestions. She said David finally had to set boundaries with you because you were making everything about yourself instead of focusing on their happiness." Each word felt like a physical blow. Sarah wasn't just defending her choices, she was actively rewriting history, transforming my attempts to be helpful and generous into a narrative of maternal overreach and selfishness. "But here's the part that really bothered me," Jennifer continued. "One of the bridesmaids asked about the financial contributions from parents, and Sarah said that both sets of parents had helped with costs, but that your contribution had been much less than expected because you disapproved of their choices." The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. Sarah was telling people that I had provided financial support, just less than anticipated, rather than acknowledging that I had counseled the substantial gift due to her disrespectful behavior. She was rewriting the story to make herself look like the victim of an unreasonable mother-in-law rather than taking any responsibility for the conflicts that had led to our current situation. Jennifer, she's completely fabricating that story, I said, my voice tight with controlled anger. I never gave them any money at all. I canceled the entire $15,000 gift because of how she treated me. I know that, honey, and anyone who knows you knows that, but she's creating a narrative that makes her look reasonable, and you look difficult. And the worst part is that David isn't correcting any of it. That revelation hit me like a punch to the stomach. David was allowing his wife to spread false information about me, to damage my reputation with people who cared about our family. He was letting Sarah lie about our conflicts, rather than taking responsibility for his role in the situation, or defending my character. As Jennifer and I stood there processing this information, I realized that my decision to bring an alternative wedding gift had been more prescient than I had imagined. The photo collage and note about the cancelled gift wouldn't just be a private message to David and Sarette, would be a public correction of the false narrative that Sarah had been spreading. When are you planning to give them your gift? Jennifer asked, clearly thinking along the same lines. During the gift opening, when everyone can see it, I replied, I think it's time for the truth to come out. The reception was about to become much more interesting than anyone had anticipated. Sarah had chosen to spread lies about me to protect her image, but she was about to learn that truth has a way of surfacing, especially when someone has been pushed too far for too long. As we returned to our respective tables, I felt a strange sense of calm descending over me. The time for diplomacy and discretion was over. Sarah had made this conflict public through her gossip and lies, and now she was going to face the consequences of that choice in a very public way. The real celebration was just beginning. The moment I had been both dreading and anticipating arrived shortly after dinner, when the DJ announced that it was time for the gift presentation. This was a tradition that Sarah had insisted on including in the reception timeline, a public display of the presents they had received, with special acknowledgement of particularly generous gifts from family and friends. I watched from table 8 as David and Sarah took their seats at a specially decorated table near the dance floor, surrounded by an impressive array of wrapped packages. The pile of gifts was substantial, reflecting the generosity of family and friends who wanted to celebrate their new marriage. Silver picture frames, crystal vases, kitchen appliances, and elegant home decor items were artfully arranged to create an impressive display. Sarah looked radiant as she began opening packages, exclaiming over each gift with enthusiasm and grace. She held up a beautiful set of wine glasses from David's godfather, thanked his college friends for the high-end coffee maker, and gushed appropriately over the hand-quilted throw from her grandmother. David sat beside her, smiling and nodding, occasionally reading cards aloud when Sarah requested it. The gifts from both sets of parents had been saved for last. As was traditional, Sarah's parents had given them a check for $8,000 toward their honeymoon, which was announced with appropriate fanfare and applause. David's godfather had contributed a generous gift certificate for furniture shopping. Various aunts and uncles had provided substantial contributions that were acknowledged with warm thanks and promises to use the money wisely. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. And this beautiful package is from Ruth, the DJ announced, reading from the card I had attached. David's mother has prepared something very special for the happy couple. I felt every eye in the room turned toward me as David reached for my carefully wrapped gift. The package looked elegant and substantial, suggesting something meaningful and expensive. Sarah leaned forward with interest, probably expecting some sort of compromise. Gift perhaps, not the full amount I had originally planned, but still a generous contribution that would demonstrate family support. David unwrapped the package carefully, revealing the professional framing and elegant matting I had chosen. When he turned the frame around to show the room, I heard several gasps and murmurs of confusion. Instead of a traditional wedding gift, he was holding a beautifully arranged photo collage featuring pictures from his childhood and adolescence. Photos, Sarah said, her voice betraying her confusion and disappointment. Pictures of David growing up. David was studying the collage more carefully, and I could see the exact moment when he spotted the handwritten note mounted prominently in the center. His face went pale as he began to read, and Sarah leaned over to look at what had captured his attention so completely. The note was written in my careful handwriting, on elegant stationery. Dear David and Sarah, this photo collage represents 12 years of love, sacrifice, and dedication. The original wedding gift was to be a check for $15,000 to help you build your new life together. However, respect and gratitude are prerequisites for such generosity. When basic courtesy and family values are dismissed as too traditional, it becomes necessary to reconsider what kinds of behavior we choose to enable and reward. I hope your marriage will be built on mutual respect, not just for each other, but for all the family members who love and support you. True wealth comes from relationships based on honor, appreciation, and genuine care for one another's feelings. With love and hope for your growth, Ruth. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see David reading and rereading the note, his face cycling through shock, embarrassment, and growing understanding. Sarah had gone completely white, her eyes darting between the photo collage and the faces of the guests who were clearly trying to process what they had just witnessed. $15,000. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphone the DJ was using picked up her words and broadcast them to the entire reception. You were going to give us $15,000. The number hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Guests began murmuring to each other, clearly shocked by the amount and confused about why such a substantial gift had been altered. The math wasn't difficult to figure out. If I had planned to give them $15,000 but had instead given them a photo collage, something significant must have happened to change my mind. David stood up slowly, still holding the frame, his face a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite read. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the room. Mom, he said, looking directly at me across the reception hall. Can we talk privately? But Sarah wasn't ready to let the moment pass quietly. Her shock was transforming into anger, and her voice was getting stronger and more defensive. I don't understand, she said, standing up beside David. Ruth, what is this supposed to mean? What are you trying to say about respect and family values? We've been nothing but respectful to you. The challenge was direct and public, and suddenly every guest in the room was watching a family drama unfold in real time. I could see people pulling out their phones, some probably recording what was clearly going to be a memorable moment in wedding reception history. I stood up at my table, maintaining my composure despite the intensity of the moment. When I spoke, my voice was calm but clear enough for everyone to hear. Sarah, I think the note explains my feelings quite clearly. I spent months trying to be part of your wedding planning, offering ideas, traditions, and financial support. But every contribution was dismissed as too traditional or unwanted. I realized that while you were happy to accept my money, you had no interest in accepting me as part of your family. The room was completely silent now, with even the waitstaff stopping their activities to watch the confrontation unfold. Sarah's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, and I could see her struggling to control her response in such a public setting. That's not true, she said, her voice rising slightly. We appreciated everything you offered. We just had our own vision for the wedding. That doesn't mean we don't respect you. Sarah, I replied gently but firmly, you told your bridal party that I was too traditional for your wedding. You rejected every family tradition I tried to share, dismissed my invitation designs without consideration, and seated me in the fourth row like a distant acquaintance rather than the mother of the groom. Those actions speak louder than any words about how much you respect me or value my place in David's life. The specificity of my response was having an impact on the guests, many of whom had probably noticed some of these things but hadn't understood the full context. I could see people nodding slightly, connecting dots about the seating arrangement and other small details that had seemed odd throughout the day. David was looking between his new wife and his mother with growing distress, clearly realizing that this confrontation was spiraling beyond anything he had anticipated. Please, he said, his voice barely audible, can we not do this here, in front of everyone? But the damage was already done. The gift presentation had become a public revelation about family conflicts that could no longer be hidden or minimized. Sarah's lies about my contributions were being exposed. My months of marginalization were being acknowledged, and the real reasons for our estrangement were finally being aired in front of people who cared about David and our family. As I sat back down, still maintaining my dignity despite the emotional intensity of the moment, I realized that this confrontation had been inevitable. Sarah's decision to spread false narratives about our conflicts had made a public reckoning necessary. The truth was finally coming out, and it was up to David and Sarah to decide how they wanted to respond to it. The wedding reception had just become a family intervention, and everyone in attendance was about to learn some important lessons about respect, generosity, and the real cost of taking family love for granted. The immediate aftermath of my gift presentation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The reception hall, which moments before had been filled with celebration and laughter, was now charged with tension and uncomfortable silence. Guests sat frozen at their tables, unsure whether to look away politely or continue watching the family drama that was unfolding before them. David set the photo collage down on the gift table with shaking hands, his face pale and his eyes darting between Sarah and me as if trying to calculate the damage that had just been done to his wedding day. Sarah stood beside him, her wedding dress suddenly seeming too bright and festive for the gravity of the moment that had just transpired. The DJ, clearly unprepared for this kind of situation, attempted to restore some normalcy by announcing that dinner service would continue, but his words seemed to fall into a void. The carefully orchestrated celebration had been derailed by truth-telling, and there was no easy way to get back on track. Sarah's parents were the first to react. I watched as her mother, Maria, whispered urgently to her father, Carlos, their faces showing confusion and concern. They had obviously not been aware of the full extent of the conflicts between Sarah and me, and the public revelation of a cancelled $15,000 gift was clearly shocking to them. Maria stood up and approached the head table, her expression suggesting she intended to manage whatever crisis was unfolding. But it was Sarah's response that surprised me most. Instead of the angry defensiveness I had expected, she seemed to deflate before my eyes. The confrontation had stripped away her ability to control the narrative, and she was facing the reality that her treatment of me had been witnessed and judged by people whose opinions mattered to her. David, she said quietly, but the microphone still picked up her words. Maybe we should talk to your mother privately. It was the first time all day that she had suggested including me in any conversation, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Now that the truth was public, now that her lies had been exposed, suddenly she was interested in dialogue. David nodded mutely and approached my table, his face a mixture of embarrassment and desperation. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet, I had to lean forward to hear him. Mom, please, can we go somewhere and talk about this away from everyone? I looked at my son, this young man I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and saw not anger or defiance, but genuine distress and confusion. The public confrontation had forced him to face the reality of what had been happening in our family, and he was clearly struggling to process it all. Of course, David, I said gently, I think that would be wise. As we prepared to leave the reception hall for a private conversation, I was approached by several people whose reactions revealed just how much impact the gift presentation had made on the gathered guests. Jennifer reached me first, her eyes bright with tears of what looked like pride and relief. Ruth, honey, I know that was difficult, but I'm so glad you finally stood up for yourself. Someone needed to say what you just said. Tom Martinez, David's college friend, caught my arm as I passed his table. Mrs. Lee, he said quietly, we had no idea. The way Sarah has been talking, we thought you were the one being unreasonable, but what you just described explains so much about what we've been observing today. Even some of Sarah's relatives approached me with expressions of concern and understanding. Her Aunt Patricia, whom I had met at the engagement dinner, looked genuinely distressed. Ruth, I'm so sorry, she said. I had no idea Sarah was treating you this way. That's not how we raised her to behave toward family, and I'm honestly shocked by what you've described. These conversations were validating in ways I hadn't expected. The people who cared about David and our family could see that my actions weren't motivated by spite or jealousy, but by a legitimate need to address disrespectful behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. But the most meaningful interaction came from an unexpected source. Sarah's mother, Maria, approached me as David and Sarah waited near the exit. Ruth, she said, her voice heavy with emotion, I owe you an apology. If I had known how Sarah was treating you, I would have spoken to her immediately. The behavior you've described is not acceptable, and I'm ashamed that my daughter has acted this way toward her future mother. Maria's acknowledgement meant more to me than I could express. Here was another mother, someone who understood the complexities of family relationships and the importance of mutual respect. Her validation confirmed what I had known all along, that Expecting basic courtesy and appreciation wasn't unreasonable or old-fashioned, double quotes Maria. I don't blame you, I replied. You couldn't know what you weren't told. But I hope you understand why I felt I had to take a stand. I absolutely understand, she said firmly, and I want you to know that Carlos and I will be having a serious conversation with Sarah about her behavior. This is not how we taught her to treat family, and it's not acceptable regardless of generational differences or wedding stress. As we finally made our way to a private room that the venue coordinator had quickly arranged, I reflected on how dramatically the evening had shifted. What had started as a carefully orchestrated celebration had become an unplanned moment of truth-telling that would likely be remembered long after the flowers had wilted and the cake had been eaten. The private conversation that followed was unlike any discussion David and I had ever had. Away from the public audience and the pressure of maintaining appearances, both he and Sarah seemed to deflate into more honest versions of themselves. Sarah's carefully constructed persona as the gracious bride crumbled, and David's attempts to avoid conflict finally gave way to genuine engagement with the problems that had been festering for months. Mom, David began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I had no idea the gift was going to be so dramatic. When you said you had canceled your contribution, I thought you meant you had reduced it or changed it to something smaller. I didn't realize you were planning to make such a public statement, David. The public nature of tonight's revelation was Sarah's choice, not mine, I replied calmly. She chose to spread false information about our conflicts to your friends and family. She chose to lie about my financial contributions and paint me as an unreasonable mother-in-law. I simply chose to correct the record. Sarah, who had been silent since we entered the private room, finally spoke up. I never lied about anything. I just told people that wedding planning had been stressful, and that we had some disagreements about traditions and style. Sarah, I said, looking directly at her. You told your bridesmaids that my financial contribution was much less than expected. Rather than acknowledging that I had canceled it entirely due to your disrespectful behavior, you told people that I had tried to take over your wedding planning, when the truth is that you rejected every suggestion I made. You characterized months of dismissive treatment as simple disagreements about style. The specificity of my response seemed to hit home. Sarah's face flushed, and she looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed to be grappling with the reality of her own behavior, rather than defending or justifying it. I didn't mean for things to get so complicated, she said finally, her voice small and uncertain. I just wanted our wedding to be perfect, to reflect our vision as a couple. I didn't think about how my choices might be affecting you. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I had received from her in months of conflict, but it still fell short of taking full responsibility for her actions. She was framing her behavior as oversight rather than deliberate disrespect, as if hurting my feelings had been an unintended side effect rather than a predictable consequence of her choices. Sarah, I said gently but firmly, this isn't about your wedding being perfect or reflecting your vision as a couple. This is about basic respect for family relationships. When you marry David, you're not just getting a husband, you're joining a family that has its own history, traditions, and values. Honoring those things doesn't mean sacrificing your own preferences, but it does mean finding ways to include, rather than exclude, the people who love your husband. David had been listening to our exchange with growing understanding, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of realization that hadn't been there before. Mom, I think I've been so focused on making Sarah happy and avoiding conflict that I stopped paying attention to how you were being treated. I kept telling myself that you were being too sensitive or that Sarah was just stressed. But listening to you now, I can see that I was wrong. His acknowledgement was both healing and heartbreaking. This was the son I had raised capable of growth, self-reflection, and taking responsibility for his mistakes. But it had taken a public confrontation and the potential damage to his wedding day for him to finally see what had been happening right in front of him. David, I understand that you are trying to balance competing loyalties, I replied. But marriage doesn't mean choosing your spouse over your family, it means expanding your family to include everyone you love. The goal should be creating relationships where everyone feels respected and valued, not where some people have to sacrifice their dignity for the sake of peace. As our conversation continued, something fundamental began to shift in the room. The defensiveness that had characterized so many of our previous interactions started to give way to genuine dialogue about expectations. boundaries, and the kind of family relationships we all wanted to build going forward. But I also realized that while this conversation was necessary and potentially healing, the damage done to the wedding celebration was irreversible. Guests would be going home with stories about family drama and canceled gifts rather than memories of joy and celebration. The reception had been fundamentally altered by the truth-telling that had finally occurred. The question now was whether David and Sarah would learn from this experience and work to build better relationships going forward, or whether the embarrassment and conflict of their wedding day would create permanent resentments that would poison their marriage and our family bonds for years to come. As we prepared to return to the reception, where guests were undoubtedly still processing what they had witnessed, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension about what came next. The weeks following David's wedding passed in an odd mixture of peace and uncertainty. After the dramatic confrontation at the reception, our family had entered uncharted territory where the old dynamics no longer apply, but new ones hadn't yet been established. The public nature of our conflict had changed everything, making it impossible to pretend that serious problems didn't exist, or that they could be solved with time and avoidance. I returned to my normal routine with a sense of relief I hadn't expected. My real estate practice had always been my refuge during difficult times, and throwing myself back into work felt like a return to solid ground after months of emotional turmoil. I had 3 new listings to prepare, a difficult negotiation to navigate, and the comfortable predictability of professional challenges that had clear solutions. The silence from David and Sarah was profound but not entirely surprising. I hadn't heard from either of them since our private conversation at the reception, when we had agreed that everyone needed time to process what had happened and figure out how to move forward. Part of me missed my son, terribly missed our regular phone calls, our Sunday dinners, and the easy relationship we had shared before Sarah entered our lives, but I also felt a lightness that came from no longer walking on eggshells or suppressing my feelings to maintain peace. My colleagues at the real estate office noticed the change in my demeanor almost immediately. I was more focused, more confident, and more willing to take on challenging clients and difficult properties. It was as if standing up for myself at the wedding had reminded me of my own strength and capability, qualities that had gotten lost in the emotional exhaustion of trying to navigate an impossible family situation. 3 weeks after the wedding, I received an unexpected recognition that felt like validation from the universe. The Regional Real Estate Association announced that I had been selected as Agent of the Year, an honor that reflected not just my sales numbers but my reputation for integrity and client service. The award came with a beautiful crystal plaque that I proudly displayed in my office, a tangible reminder that my professional life was thriving even as my personal relationships remained complicated. The award ceremony was held at the downtown Marriott, and as I accepted the recognition in front of my peers, I felt a surge of pride and accomplishment that had nothing to do with being someone's mother or mother-in-law. I was being honored for my own achievements, my own contributions, my own value as a professional and community member. It was a powerful reminder that my identity extended far beyond my family relationships, even though those relationships remained deeply important to me. Jennifer attended the ceremony and took photos of me accepting the award, pictures that captured a version of myself I had almost forgotten existed during the months of wedding planning stress. In these photos, I looked confident, successful, and genuinely happy, a woman who knew her own worth and didn't need external validation to feel complete. The support I received from friends and extended family during this period was both surprising and healing. People who had witnessed the wedding reception confrontation reached out to express their admiration for how I had handled a difficult situation with dignity and grace. Several relatives told me they had been watching the family dynamics for months and were relieved that someone had finally addressed the problems that everyone could see, but no one wanted to discuss. My sister Jennifer became my closest confidant during this period, checking in regularly and providing the kind of emotional support that helped me maintain perspective about the choices I had made. She assured me repeatedly that standing up for myself had been not only justified but necessary, and that any temporary damage to family relationships was better than continuing to enable disrespectful behavior. "Ruth," she told me during one of our weekly coffee dates, "I've watched you bend over backward for months, trying to make Sarah comfortable, trying to be the perfect mother-in-law, trying to avoid conflict at all costs. But you can't build healthy relationships with people who don't respect you, Sometimes you have to be willing to risk a relationship in order to save it. Her words resonated deeply because they captured something I had been struggling to articulate about my own decision-making process. I hadn't canceled the wedding gift to punish David and Sarai, had done it to establish boundaries that might eventually lead to healthier relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. But the silence from David was taking its toll, even though I understood why it was happening. He was presumably dealing with Sarah's reaction to the wedding confrontation, processing his own role in the family conflicts, and trying to figure out how to repair relationships that had been damaged by months of poor communication and unaddressed resentments. I found myself wondering about their honeymoon, their adjustment to married life, and whether the lessons from their wedding day had sparked any meaningful changes in how they approached family relationships. But I resisted the urge to reach out first, knowing that David needed to take responsibility for rebuilding our relationship, rather than expecting me to continue being the one who smoothed over problems and maintained connections, despite being treated poorly. My focus during this period was on rediscovering my own life and interests outside of being David's mother. I rejoined my book club, which I had neglected during the intense months of wedding planning. I started taking weekend trips to nearby cities, exploring museums and restaurants without worrying about accommodating anyone else's preferences or schedule. I even began considering the possibility of dating again, something I hadn't seriously contemplated since Michael's death 8 years earlier. The quiet time also gave me space to reflect on the lessons I had learned about family relationships, boundaries, and the difference between loving someone and enabling their poor behavior. I realized that my attempts to be the perfect mother-in-law had actually been counterproductive, teaching Sarah that she could treat me disrespectfully without consequences and showing David that his mother's feelings were less important than avoiding conflict. 1 month after the wedding, I made a decision that surprised even me. I updated my will and estate planning documents, ensuring that my assets would be distributed in a way that reflected my values about family responsibility and mutual respect. It wasn't a vindictive action, but rather a thoughtful consideration of how to encourage better behavior through clear expectations and consequences. The changes weren't dramatic. David would still inherit the majority of my estate, but there were now conditions attached to certain gifts that required demonstration of respect for family relationships and participation in maintaining family traditions. I also established a scholarship fund in Miko's memory that would support students who demonstrated both academic achievement and commitment to family values. As I signed the updated documents in my attorney's office, I felt a sense of completion about the entire wedding experience. I had drawn clear boundaries, established consequences for disrespectful behavior, and taken steps to ensure that future generations would understand the importance of treating family members with dignity and appreciation. The question that remained was whether David would recognize the seriousness of the situation and take steps to repair our relationship, or whether his marriage would mark the beginning of a permanent estrangement that would diminish both our lives in ways that could have been easily avoided with a little more wisdom and a lot more respect. 6 weeks after the wedding, the first crack in David and Sarah's perfect facade appeared in an unexpected way. I learned about it not from David himself, but from Jennifer, who had heard from her neighbor that David had been seen at the grocery store alone, looking stressed and distracted, a far cry from the blissful newlywed one might expect. The reality of married life, it seemed, was proving more challenging than the fairy tale wedding they had worked so hard to create. Without my financial support, they had taken on debt to fund their elaborate celebration, and the monthly payments were straining their budget in ways that were affecting every aspect of their relationship. But the financial pressure was just the beginning. According to Jennifer's careful observations and the family gossip network that had been quietly monitoring the situation, Sarah's demanding nature, which had been focused on wedding planning for months, had simply shifted to other aspects of their life together. She had strong opinions about their apartment decor, their social calendar, their career decisions, and their financial priorities. And David was discovering that marriage to someone with such rigid expectations was exhausting. More telling was the information that filtered back to me through David's college friends, who remained loyal to both of us despite the recent family drama. Tom Martinez mentioned during a chance encounter at the coffee shop that David had seemed withdrawn at a recent gathering, declining invitations to social events, and making excuses about money being tight. He mentioned that wedding expenses were higher than expected. Tom told me carefully, clearly trying to share information without betraying David's confidence. And he seemed stressed about some family stuff, though he didn't go into details. The family stuff was undoubtedly the ongoing tension between Sarah and me, compounded by David's growing realization that his new wife's behavior toward his mother had been neither justified nor acceptable. The public nature of our wedding confrontation had forced him to see our conflicts through the eyes of people whose opinions he respected, and that perspective was apparently uncomfortable. 3 months after the wedding, I made a decision that reflected my new commitment to prioritizing relationships that valued and respected me. I quietly revised my inheritance planning, not out of vindictiveness, but out of a practical recognition that David's choices had consequences that extended beyond our personal relationship. The legal documents I signed that Tuesday morning represented a careful rebalancing of my estate planning. David would still inherit my house and the majority of my assets, but several specific bequests had been modified to reflect the current state of our relationship. The $50,000 I had originally planned to leave him for a house down payment was redirected to a scholarship fund in Michael's name. The family heirlooms that I had hoped to pass down, including my grandmother's pearl necklace, were now designated for Jennifer's daughter, who had always shown genuine appreciation for our family history. Most significantly, I established a provision that would restore David's full inheritance if he demonstrated, over a period of at least 2 years, a commitment to rebuilding our relationship based on mutual respect and genuine effort to honor our family values. It wasn't a punishment, but rather an incentive structure designed to encourage the kind of behavior that builds strong family bonds. My attorney, Margaret Chen, reviewed the documents with the thorough professionalism I had come to expect from her over the years. "Ruth, these changes reflect a lot of thoughtfulness about family dynamics and long-term relationship building," she observed. "You're creating accountability while still leaving room for growth and redemption." Her assessment captured exactly what I was trying to accomplish. I wasn't giving up on my son, but I was establishing clear expectations about the kind of relationship I was willing to accept going forward. Love without boundaries had proven ineffective. Perhaps love with clear consequences would prove more educational. The changes weren't motivated by anger, but by a realistic assessment of what had transpired and what needed to change for our family relationships to be healthy and sustainable. David had chosen to prioritize his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity, and that choice needed to have meaningful consequences if he was ever going to understand the full impact of his decisions. Meanwhile, the financial pressures on David and Sarah's marriage were intensifying. Without my $15,000 contribution, they had relied on credit cards and loans to fund their dream wedding, and the monthly payments were creating stress that extended far beyond their budget spreadsheet. Jennifer reported that she had overheard Sarah on the phone with her mother, complaining about money being tight and expressing regret about some of their more expensive wedding choices. The irony wasn't lost on me. The couple who had dismissed my contributions as coming with too many strings attached was now discovering that borrowed money came with much more restrictive and expensive conditions. Credit card companies and banks were far less forgiving than a mother-in-law who simply wanted to be treated with respect and included in meaningful ways. 4 months after the wedding, David finally broke his silence with a phone call that caught me off guard with its timing and tone. I was reviewing property listings in my home office when his name appeared on my caller ID, and I felt my heart skip a beat despite everything that had transpired between us. "Mom," he said, his voice heavy with an exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness, "I think I owe you an apology." Several apologies, actually. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. David spoke with a maturity and self-awareness that suggested he had been doing serious thinking about our family dynamics and his role in the conflicts that had damaged our relationship. He acknowledged that he had failed to defend me, that he had minimized my feelings to avoid confronting Sarah's behavior, and that he had taken my love and support for granted in ways that were neither fair nor sustainable. "I've been watching how Sarah interacts with people," he said quietly, "and I'm starting to see patterns that I didn't want to acknowledge before. The way she treated you wasn't unique. She has a way of dismissing people who don't agree with her or fit into her vision of how things should be. I just didn't want to see it because it was easier to blame you for being too sensitive than to address problems in my relationship." His honesty was both painful and hopeful. It suggested that the lessons from our wedding confrontation were finally sinking in. that he was developing the kind of insight that might lead to meaningful changes in how he approached relationships and family responsibilities. But I also realized that recognition of problems was just the first step. The real test would be whether David was willing to take concrete actions to rebuild our relationship and establish healthier boundaries in his marriage, changes that would require courage, commitment, and the kind of difficult conversations he had been avoiding for months. 6 months after the wedding that changed everything, I found myself sitting in my favorite coffee shop on a crisp Saturday morning, reviewing the remarkable transformation that had taken place in my life. The woman sipping her latte and reading the newspaper was fundamentally different from the one who had spent months bending over backward to accommodate a daughter-in-law's unrealistic expectations and a son's unwillingness to set appropriate boundaries. On my desk at home, replacing the old family photo that had included David and Sarah from happier times, sat a new picture from my recent vacation to Tuscany with Jennifer and 2 other friends. In the photo, I'm laughing genuinely, my face relaxed and happy in a way that reflected the inner peace I had found by prioritizing relationships that brought joy rather than stress into my life. The Italy trip had been spontaneous, something the old Ruth would never have considered without first checking David's schedule and ensuring that my absence wouldn't inconvenience anyone. But the new Ruth had booked the trip with excitement, spending 10 days exploring vineyards, visiting museums, and enjoying the company of women who appreciated and valued her friendship. David's efforts to rebuild our relationship had been genuine, but gradual. After his initial phone call acknowledging his mistakes, he had begun the slow work of demonstrating change rather than just promising it. He started calling regularly again, not just when he needed something but to check on my well-being and share updates about his life. He began defending me when Sarah made dismissive comments, even when it created tension in his marriage. Most significantly, he had finally had the difficult conversation with Sarah about her treatment of me and her need to show basic respect for his family. According to David, the conversation hadn't gone well initially, with Sarah becoming defensive and accusing him of choosing his mother over his wife. But David had stood firm, explaining that treating his mother with respect wasn't choosing sides, it was a non-negotiable requirement for their marriage to succeed. The changes in Sarah's behavior had been slow and somewhat reluctant, but they were noticeable. She had called to apologize for her behavior during the wedding planning, though her apology felt more strategic than heartfelt. She had made an effort to include me in a few family gatherings, though her interactions remained somewhat stiff and formal. Most importantly, she had stopped the passive-aggressive comments and eye-rolling that had characterized so many of our previous encounters. It wasn't the warm, loving relationship I had originally hoped to build with my daughter-in-law, but it was respectful and functional. Sometimes that's the best you can achieve with people whose fundamental values and approaches to family relationships differ significantly from your own. The financial consequences of their wedding choices had indeed created ongoing stress in their marriage. The debt payments from their elaborate celebration had forced them to scale back their lifestyle in ways that were particularly difficult for Sarah, who had expensive tastes and high expectations for their standard of living. They had moved to a smaller apartment, postponed plans for a house purchase, and curtailed the frequent dining out and shopping that Sarah had enjoyed during their engagement. But these financial pressures had also created an opportunity for David to develop more backbone in their relationship. When Sarah suggested asking me for help with their debt payments, David had firmly declined, explaining that they needed to take responsibility for their own financial choices. It was a small but significant demonstration of his growing understanding that my relationship with them needed to be based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. 8 months after the wedding, David made a gesture that moved me deeply. He appeared at my door on a Sunday morning with a manila envelope containing something I had never expected to see: a handwritten letter of apology from Sarah, along with my grandmother's pearl necklace, which I had offered her months earlier. "Sarah wanted you to have this back," he said, holding out the velvet jewelry box. "She realizes now that rejecting it was rejecting something important about our family, and she wants you to know that she understands what she missed by not accepting it gracefully." The letter from Sarah was more thoughtful than I had anticipated. She acknowledged that her behavior during the wedding planning had been disrespectful and hurtful, and she expressed genuine regret for the pain she had caused. She didn't make excuses or blame her actions on stress or misunderstanding. She simply took responsibility for treating me poorly, and committed to doing better going forward. I realize now that marrying David meant joining a family with its own history and traditions, she wrote. I was so focused on creating what I thought was our perfect day that I failed to understand how important it was to honor the people and values that made David who he is. I hope you'll give me another chance to be the daughter-in-law you deserve. It wasn't a perfect apology, and it had taken far too long to materialize, but it represented genuine growth and accountability. More importantly, it suggested that the difficult lessons from their wedding day had finally resulted in meaningful change. As I sit here now, reflecting on this journey of setting boundaries and demanding respect, I realized that the most important transformation was my own. I had learned to value myself enough to require others to treat me well. I had discovered that being a good mother didn't mean accepting poor treatment from my child, and that being a loving mother-in-law didn't require sacrificing my dignity to keep the peace. The $15,000 that I had originally planned to give them remained in my account, earning interest and serving as a reminder that generosity should be paired with respect. David had never asked me to reconsider that gift, which showed a maturity and understanding that gave me hope for our continued relationship. My inheritance planning remained unchanged for now, though I had included a provision that would restore David's full inheritance if he continued to demonstrate the growth and respect that he had shown over the past several months. It wasn't about punishment, it was about ensuring that the values Michael and I had tried to instill in him would continue to guide his choices long after we were gone. The family relationships that had been damaged by months of conflict were slowly healing, but they were different now, more honest, more boundaried, and more respectful. Jennifer often remarked that I seemed happier and more confident than I had been in years, and she was right. Standing up for myself had reminded me of my own strength and worth. For anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation, dismissed by family members, taken for granted by people they love, or struggling to maintain their dignity while trying to keep the peace, I want you to know that setting boundaries isn't selfish, requiring respect isn't unreasonable. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable behavior that damages relationships and hurts people. Love doesn't mean accepting disrespect. Family doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity, and generosity doesn't require tolerating poor treatment from the people you're trying to help. The woman in the photo on my desk, laughing with friends in the Tuscan sunshine, owes her worth and demands that others recognize it too. It took a cancelled wedding gift and a very public confrontation to get there, but it was worth every uncomfortable moment to reclaim my self-respect and teach my family that love comes with expectations. That's a lesson worth $15,000 and a gift that will keep giving for generations to come.